Molt bé, moltes gràcies per venir. Benvinguts a una nova conferència, un nou seminari de l'Institut d'Estudis de l'Autogovern. El professor Hechter em demanava si ens podíem presentar breument, com que som en format seminari, si podíem dir els noms o l'afiliació així breument. Si voleu, començo presentant-los amb ells i després fem una ronda per presentar-nos nosaltres. We are lucky today, we are fortunate to have Professors Hechter and Siroky. They are professors at the School of Politics and Global Studies of Arizona State University, and Professor Hechter is also professor in Copenhagen. And you probably know them because they are well-known scholars, very well-known scholars, working on regionalism, secessionism, nationalism, civil war. They have performed specific studies, case studies, but also some large end studies on this topic. I remember when I was a student, I read the book containing nationalism, published in Oxford, by Oxford University Press, and I have read some papers from Professor Siroky, written by Professor Siroky on civil war, civil war and post-communist cases also. And I think that we are really lucky to have them here today. When I talked to Sin Muller, my colleague Sin Muller, who is doing research with them, he said, well, I can tell you that they are both in Europe this week, so they will be able to come to Barcelona to do this, to talk in this seminar. So today they are going to present us a model research that they are doing on bargaining, center-periphery bargaining, and a model of certain center-periphery bargaining. And I think that we are all interested in that. I think we have two main interests on this topic. First, an academic interest. I think that it's a well-performed research, and we all want to know more about that. But we also have a political motivation for that, because well, I think it's not necessary to explain the moment that we are living in Catalonia and Spain, and we are all talking every day, every week on this topic of center-periphery bargaining. So before they start the presentation, let me do a very brief, tour de table to present yourself.
Bon dia, jo soc Gerard Martín, soc el cap de l'àrea d'assessorament en matèria d'organització territorial del poder de l'Institut d'Estudis d'Autogovern i soc professor associat de Dret Constitucional de la Universitat de Barcelona, la Facultat de Dret de la Universitat de Barcelona.
Hola, jo soc l'Helena Mora i treballo amb el Gerard Martín amb l'àrea de desenvolupament autonòmic. Soc la responsable d'estudis i iniciatives autonòmiques.
Well, we met before, Mireia Grau, head of the research unit, lecturer on public policy some time ago, and a political scientist.
My name is Jordi Vergés. I'm an economist, and I work in the prospective analysis unit of the Canon Presidency.
My name is Anna Haile. I work here in the Institute.
Jo soc en Guillem Clapés i treballo com a professor Reniu a l'Oficina per la Millora de les Instal·lacions d'autogovern.
Hello, my name is Dolors Feliu. I'm a director of public advisor, juridic advisor at the law advisor at the Generalitat de Catalunya.
Hi, good morning. Welcome to Catalonia. My name is Josep Maria Reniu. Actually, I'm the director of the Office for the Improvement of Self-Government Institutions at the Government of Catalonia. And prior, in fact, I'm a political scientist working on coalition governments.
Okay, so thank you for this, for introducing yourself. I am Marcel Jaume, I'm a political scientist working here, former member of the political science faculty at Center-Periphery University, and currently I am still teaching their introduction to political science as an invited professor. So I think we can start. You have 45 minutes, the time you need to explain your model and your research, and then we will open the floor for discussion. I already have some comments, but I think that our public will have comments too. So, yeah.
Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be in Barcelona. I've often thought that Barcelona really looks like the national capital. So it has all the flavor of a national capital, and maybe someday it will be. We're going to talk about two different papers. One which was published online in the European Political Science Review just in December of 2015, and I'm going to be talking about that paper for about 20 minutes, and then David will be talking about another paper which is coming out in the Swiss Political Science Review. And the talk will be divided in the following way. I will talk about the demand for secession or nationalism, and David will be presenting a little game theoretic model of bargaining between centers and peripheries, and of the conditions under which centers will grant concessions to peripheries as a means of keeping them within the central state. Okay, so, all right. So the first question is, what explains the differential demand for separatism across territories within a central state? It so happens that the paper that we're talking about is about a particular region within Switzerland called the Jura Bernois, but I want to talk more generally about that. So there are two fundamentally different kinds of arguments about what would explain the demand for secession. The first one, fundamentally cultural, in which people dislike being ruled by others who come from a different cultural group. So obviously, you understand that. A lot of people here speak Catalan, and that's a different language from Castilian, and you don't like it necessarily when Castilians are making decisions that affect policy in Catalonia. The basic role of government is to provide public goods, and the problem in a multicultural society is that if the dominant group provides either insufficient public goods or the wrong kind of public goods, it leads to resentment on the part of the periphery. The second way that people talk about this is by a very simple kind of rational choice argument, which is that people make political choices on the basis of their political and economic preferences. Okay? The problem in the first approach is that it doesn't really specify much about what the causes of this are, and it doesn't also specify which of the multiple cultural identities that could exist within a country become the basis for affiliation. This is particularly an issue in Switzerland because in Switzerland you have both fundamental religious differences between Protestants and Catholics and linguistic differences between Francophones and, what's the word, Germanophones? People who speak German. So that's missing in the political culture approach generally. And what's missing in the rational choice approach is also something pretty fundamental, which is it doesn't say anything about where these preferences come from. It's exogenous to their models. And therefore it leaves open any kind of preference that could dominate in a country. So what we do in this paper that came out in European Political Science Review is to try to integrate or synthesize these two ways of looking at secession. We say that culture in this paper is the fundamental source of individual preferences, and that once those preferences are set, people tend to vote according to what their preferences are. So they vote rationally to promote the preferences that they have, but the preferences that they have come fundamentally from the culture of the region that they're in, okay? So the point is that alien rule is illegitimate, as I said, because it produces suboptimal policies from the point of view of the periphery. And the illegitimacy of alien rule can be mitigated by political concessions that the center makes to the region, ranging from symbolic ones to actually fundamental ones involving governance and fiscal autonomy. And that is the subject of part of the paper that David will talk about at the end, after I'm finished. So here we present a very simple two-stage model in which stage one is the cultural legacies which produce the preferences that we think are important. And in stage two, people vote on the basis of those preferences and on the basis of certain kinds of ecological factors that I don't think we're going to talk about much. But, and then the end, at stage three is the outcome, which is that they decide to secede. So that's the sort of argument that we want to make, that there is no conflict between the cultural and rationalist approaches, that they need to be synthesized and integrated together. Okay, so the case that we're going to talk about is a case that you may not, it's a fairly obscure case, I guess. It deals with the part of Switzerland called the Swiss Jura. Now, a long time ago, I don't remember when, maybe in 1815 or something like that, you know, Switzerland has this highly decentralized system in which cantons have a great deal of autonomy, and they're essentially like little states. And the canton of Bern, which was a very large canton, had, and dominantly German and Protestant, it had a part of it, part of its territory was French-speaking. And among the French, in the French-speaking territory, there was a growing demand for separation on the basis of language from Bern, which the French-speaking area was largely French and Catholic, and Bern was Protestant and German. And so there became a nationalist movement, a secessionist movement in the French-speaking part of Bern, which then actually ended up with some violence in 1973 or 1974. Very unusual in Swiss politics, not as unusual in Spanish politics. But, and as a result of the violence and the growing mobilization, there was a referendum held in 1974 among all of the French speakers and asking, would you like to hive off and create a separate canton? Would you like to secede from Bern? And a large proportion of the French-speaking population said, yes, we want to secede. And they created a new canton called Jura, which was all French-speaking. However, in 1974, a minority of the French speakers, who were largely Protestant, decided to stay with Bern rather than to join their French-speaking, their Francophone compatriots. And so the new canton of Jura only was French Catholic. Now, in the years subsequent to 1974, the Francophone nationalists wanted to create an all French-speaking canton, including both the Protestants and the Catholics. And in 2013, another referendum was held in Switzerland in which all the French speakers could vote on whether they wanted to have this larger Jurassian canton, which would be both French-speaking and Catholic and Protestant. And the vote that happened in 2013 was strikingly similar to the one in 1974. About 70% of the people in Jura wanted to join with their French-speaking colleagues in the South, and about 70% of the French Protestants wanted to stay with the German Protestants. So our paper tries to analyze what was going on in that 2013 vote. And that's a picture of where Jura is in Switzerland, and also a map of the distribution of the two major religions. And this is both parts of Jura. The dark part is the part that is largely French-speaking and Protestant, and voted no to join, to secede from Bern. And the light part is the French Catholic part. And we analyzed, what are these, David? Are these municipalities? Very small ecological units, the votes from each of these units. And we could merge them with Swiss have great data. We could merge them with all kinds of socio-demographic data at these levels. And that's how we compared did the analysis. So we were testing a number of hypotheses. The first one, sort of the cultural one, municipalities with more French speakers and more Catholics more likely to vote in favor of seceding from Bern. The second one, municipalities with more statist political preferences are more likely to vote in favor of seceding from Bern. I have to explain something about this. The difference in what we found, somewhat to our surprise, is that why should religion have mattered in this vote, since everybody knows that the Swiss are highly non-religious. It's not like they go to church. It's not like there's a lot of religiosity in Switzerland. And yet we're seeing that there's a huge difference between the voters who are Protestant and the voters who are Catholic. And it turns out that there's a long cultural legacy of Protestantism and Catholicism that has to do with the role that the state would play in providing welfare for people who are not doing well in society. And the Catholics are much more interested in redistributing income within their societies than the Protestants are. The Protestants are much more individualistically oriented. This comes from Durkheim. It's a long, long tradition of social theory. So on that basis, we think that the Catholics were more interested in state intervention into the economy, and Protestants less. Also, there's a difference between French speakers and German speakers with respect to that too. France has a much more statist economy, Germany a much more neoliberal economy. So on both grounds of religion and language, French Catholics, we hypothesized we're going to be much more in favor of statist policies, and German Protestants less so. Okay? And both of these things were reinforcing each other. I'm not going to go into it. Switzerland is a wonderful case because of lots of data issues and because of the complexity of its cultural differences. So in the paper, we did some interviews with key politicians from different regions. We looked at the census data, we looked at the electoral data, both from '74 and 2013, and the data also from 2010 and 2014. And we did certain kinds of regressions that David can talk about at the municipal level for 2013. And this is as you can see, here's the percentage of yes votes in the referendum by municipality in Jura-Bernois, which is the French Protestant part that voted no. As you can see, there's a fair amount of variation. It's not like all the French Protestant parts of Jura voted the same. Actually, you can see that it was a slight majority in the capital city of Moutier. About 51 or 52% were in favor of joining the Jurassian, the new canton. And all the way to the right, there's this place called Seehof, which basically 2% wanted to join. So we're trying to, the paper tries to explain variation, this variation. And what we do is we try to test these hypotheses. The first one, we create a model that tries to predict preferences on the basis of cultural factors. And the second uses those preferences along with some geographical factors to predict the secession vote. And it turns out that religion and language help account for variation in political preferences over statism. Municipalities with more Catholics and more French speakers were more likely than those with less Catholics and less French speakers to vote for leftist parties promoting more statism. I should tell you that we measure statism by several kinds of referenda that were held. In Switzerland, one was about gun control and the other was about, remember which one? The second one? I don't know. Anyway, we used those as indicators of statism. And so we had a measure, two measures of statism. In the Jura equation, for the second thing, we found that these political preferences for statism, both in the form of left-wing voting, there it is, and the vote over gun control, were highly predictive. The municipalities that voted more for leftist parties and more for gun control were much more likely to vote to secede from Bern and join Jura. And ecological effects were also important. Municipalities closer to the capital of Jura, Delamont, expressed a much stronger desire to secede. And all the models provided evidence for a significant joint effect of political preferences and ecological factors on the decision to secede. And so those are some of the empirical results, which I'm not going to tell you. What? This one? I can't read it. Oh, the one before. Oh, you like it? Oh, that's the one, the cultural differences between Jura Bernois and Jura Canton, right. So as you can, this was published in Bern or something? You can see the stereotype for Jura Canton is they're only interested in drinking wine, whereas in the Protestant part of Jura Bernois, they're very industrious and they're going to make a lot of stuff and they're not going to be drunk all the time. So that's the stereotypical thing. I think these kinds of things were part of the referendum campaign. All right, and so I'm not going to go into the models, but here are the main findings, right? The study generally stresses the causal influence of cultural identities, political preferences, and ecological factors. Whereas these different views are often considered to be mutually exclusive, we combine them here in a synthetic model. And we argued, as I said before, that the cultural identities matter for explaining secessionism, but not because of their primordial attachments, not because of any particular importance to religion qua religion. The religious and linguistic groups matter because their members are imbued with cultural legacies that lead to distinctive political preferences. In this case, preferences over welfare status. Further, ecological constraints such as geography and topography affect social interaction with like-minded individuals. On the basis of these political preferences and ecological constraints, individuals then make rational choices about the desirability of secession. And instrumental considerations are therefore crucial in explaining the decision to secede, but not in a conventional pocketbook manner. Now, when we were writing this, one of the things that was happening, I think, was the Scottish referendum. Was that happening right at that time? And it was pretty clear from the discussions of the Scottish referendum that one of the major cultural differences between Scotland and England precisely had to do with status. The Scots were very much more interested and supportive of a kind of Scandinavian social democratic model than the English voters, who were much more aligned with neoliberal policy And that was clearly one of the major cultural differences between Scotland and England. And so we found a sort of echo of that in this particular case. Okay. So, and as we showed, our own model did a much better job of explaining the variation than the straightforward cultural or straightforward economic models. Okay, so that's my part of the story. David is going to now talk about a model of bargaining between the center and periphery, in which the issue at hand is when will the center give the periphery significant concessions in order to keep them in the fold. Go ahead, David. Oh, I know, yes.
So one of the reasons why we thought it would be helpful to present both of these sort of parts of the paper together is that, as Michael just said, the first focuses on the sort of demand from the mass at the mass level, and then there are politicians and elites who are bargaining at another level, and that's also important. And so the question here is basically when do those elites at the on the peripheral level manage to extract concessions from the center, which is related to the demand, because if there's no demand, then the elites have no bargaining leverage, so there has to be some demand. So I'm going to present a very stylized model, which is based on a sort of formalization of an idea by Albert Hirschman called exit voice loyalty. Right, so these have been applied to a variety of different settings, and so we thought it would be useful to apply it to this setting, since peripheral regions have at least three options. So one is they exit, they secede. A second is they remain loyal and don't ask for much. And the third is that they use their voice to try to bargain and extract more concessions. And it's a multi-stage process. In fact, it's infinite, but we just sort of capture a certain time slice. So there's sort of, as in all models, we simplify things a lot. And so one of the simplifications is that we assume, for the purposes of illustration, that the center is one actor and the periphery is one actor, but obviously in reality we're very aware that one of the issues in bargaining between the center and the periphery is that sometimes the periphery is fragmented into multiple elite sort of driven factions, as it were, some more extreme, some less extreme, some willing to negotiate, some less willing to negotiate. But this is not supposed to be a representation of reality, but just a sort of stylization of it. So the two parameters are, that we want to focus on, are the credibility of the periphery's exit options. So in other words, to what extent is it really feasible that the periphery would become a separate entity, separate political entity, either a separate canton in this case, or a separate country in other cases. And the second, and so that obviously influences the bargaining, as I'll show. The second is that to what extent is the center dependent on the periphery? And dependence, again, can be filled in with a variety of details. It could be financial dependence, it could be political dependence, it could be some other trade dependence. So if one periphery is on the port, for example, and everything has to go through there, they have some leverage over which to use as a negotiation. So in the Swiss juror case, the canton of Bern is one of the, although Switzerland as a whole is a multilingual country, each canton is essentially monolingual, with very few exceptions. There are some that speak both. Bern is one of them. So Bern is officially a bilingual canton, speaking German and French, and on this basis, they claim to be its federal center, that we can speak to all sides because we are a bilingual canton, as opposed to an all French or all German speaking canton. So those are the two parameters which I'll go into now in a bit more detail. So,
and the point is that because they are bilingual, they have certain kinds of advantages, which makes them dependent on keeping French speakers in their home.
Right. Good. It's an important point. So if the Jura Bernois was to leave and join the canton of Jura, Bern would no longer be a bilingual canton.
And would lose those privileges.
And hence it would lose its sort of legitimacy as a federal center on this basis. So there's some dependence of the canton of Bern on the region of Jura Bernois. Okay. So I'm going to now kind of set up the model, and as it were. So there are sort of two actors in this. There's the center and the periphery. Again, I said this is a stylization. There are multiple actors, obviously, and they play games both at the level of center-periphery, but also within the center and within the periphery. But that's not the game that we're focusing on here. So the style, the timeline is that first the region, R, decides whether it's going to use its exit option, its loyalty option, or its voice option. Right? And then the canton, or the center, decides whether or not, if it uses voice, to ignore it, or to begin some negotiations and offer concessions. So there is a payoff for each region from for each of the actors, what they get if this happens. So we write the payoff for the region as E, the exit. The value of the concession that they would get, we normalize to 1. L is the value that the region would get if it didn't ask for anything and just remained loyal. And C is the cost of using voice, because collective action is not free. They have to organize, and maybe by organizing and not getting, there's some cost to that. But in any case, organizing as such is a cost. People have to spend their time, their effort, and so on. So then, using this, we say there are sort of two types of sort of a 2x2 setup. So if the region does have a credible exit option, then we say that E is greater than 0, and if it does not, then E is less than 0. And if the center is dependent on the region, then L is greater than 1, and if it's not, then it's less than 1. So then we summarize 5 possible outcomes, and I'll show you a diagram of this, which I think is maybe clearer than the table. And then we just calculate the payoffs that each would get under each of these options. So one, I think it will be clearer if I present it this way. So it starts on your left, that the region chooses voice, exit, or loyalty. If it chooses exit, then it gets the exit payoff of E, and the second payoff next to it, the center gets 1, which is the concession that it would have offered, but doesn't have to offer now because the region is left. The second possibility is that the region doesn't ask for anything, in which case it gets 0, and the center gets to keep the concession that it would have offered, which is 1, plus the benefits it gets from the region's loyalty, which is L. So those are less interesting options. More interesting is when the region asks for something. So that's the region going to the sort of northwest region, so voice. So when the region asks for something, the canton then has, is there a pointer on this? So the region asks for voice, uses its voice, and then the canton, or the center, has 2 options. One is to respond and to begin some negotiations, and the other is to ignore. If it responds, then the region will get, it subtracts the cost of having to begin the negotiation, and it gets center ignores the region, it can still ask again, a second time, and then the region has to decide whether to remain loyal because it didn't get anything, or to leave. And it gets payouts for this. So this is one scenario, which is where the region has a credible exit option. It's feasible that the region could actually leave, and the center is dependent on the region. So it really needs, in this case, as and so the way this is just a simple complete information game, which can be solved through backward induction, which means that one starts at the end and asks, given that the region is here, will it choose this or this option? And since E minus C is greater than 1, when E is greater than 0 and L is greater than 1, it chooses this option. But because it never gets to this point, since the canton ignores, since the canton immediately responds at the beginning, it doesn't have to ask a second time. And so what would, here we go back and we say the region would do this at the final node. The canton would choose to respond at this node. And the region, knowing that if it uses its voice, the canton will respond, decides that it's worth using its voice here rather than choosing to exit or to choose whatever. And so this never happens, but if in another scenario it would. And so basically this is the only situation in which the center offers some concessions to the region. That is, both when the center is dependent on the periphery and when the periphery could exit if it's not given some concessions. There are 4 other scenarios, obviously. One is that the center has no dependence on the periphery, and the region has no credible exit option, right? So there are no concessions. And then there are these 2 other possibilities. So one is that the region has a credible exit threat, and the canton is dependent. And as we show here, the Nash equilibrium is that the region remains loyal and the center ignores the region. So even though the canton is dependent, we can't infer that it will offer concessions. So even if there's a rich region and it really requires wealth from that region to be redistributed, it doesn't matter for the center, because the center knows that the region can't leave anyway. So there will be no concessions offered in this model. The third scenario is where there's a credible exit option. The region could leave, but the center doesn't really depend on it. So it says, see you later, and good luck, and that happens, right? So for example, Slovakia and Czechoslovakia, right? So Slovakia had a possibility. I mean, it was credible that it would exit. It was a federal structure, so they had their own, governmental institutions. They were independent at some point before, and so on. But the center didn't care. The Czech center in Prague didn't care really. In fact, they were happy that it would leave because because Slovakia was a less economically developed region, and so they thought they could begin the transition in a much faster way without having to subsidize all sorts of heavy industries that were not relevant anymore to the future. So in other words, here, although the region had a credible exit option, it didn't matter to the center, and they said, see you later, and it was the velvet divorce. And then the final option is that the region has no credible exit option, and the center is not dependent, and obviously in this case there are no concessions being offered. Okay. So we summarize this in these sort of 2x2 table, which has these 4 possible outcomes. And it's only in a scenario where there's a credible exit threat and is dependent that the center responds to the use of voice in the first stage. And so these are the two parameters that we think are quite general and can be filled in with context-specific details that will vary by case and time, that determine whether or not the center will offer some significant concessions to the center. So we looked at this in the case of Jura, and in the case of Jura Brunois in particular, and we talked to people asking them, what did you ask for, what did you get, and so on and so forth. And because of the evidence that was presented by Michael at the beginning, that most of the municipalities within Jura Brunois, which is the southern part, the French-speaking Protestant part, were not in favor. 20-some% or so were in favor, which was less extreme, more extreme than it was in '74 when the original vote was, when there was more demand. The center in Bern realized that actually there isn't much demand for it in this Jura Brunois region to join Jura, and they therefore preferred to stay with Bern. So even though they had a credible exit option, because Jura itself, the French-speaking Catholic part, was very much in favor, 75% or so. I think the number was similar before. Even though they were very much in favor of having a sort of pan-French canton, the love between Jura and Jura Brunois was not reciprocated. It was a typical Shakespeare story. So Bern said, essentially, we don't have to offer very many concessions because they really don't want to leave anyway. The people don't want to leave. Maybe the elites want to gather more concessions, but the people themselves don't have a strong demand to leave us and to join the other region. And so as a result, there were very few concessions offered to Jura Brunois, even though they decided to remain loyal. And so this was the scenario where they had a credible exit option. They didn't have a credible exit option, but the center was dependent. So this is one of the intermediate scenarios. And as we said, only when both of those things are satisfied do you find significant concessions, or at least that's what the model predicted.
Yeah, because they didn't have a credible exit option, because there was very little demand for secession. That's why they didn't have a credible exit option.
And in a democratic setting, that matters. If it was an authoritarian setting, the elites could decide we're leaving anyway, and who cares what the people think, we'll force them to do it. So that's the sort of bargaining in the age of democracy. Has to be some correspondence, not perfect obviously, but some correspondence between what people want and what the elites are asking for. So if we see that a center is ignoring a region and not offering any concessions, even though the region is asking, trying to negotiate, we can't infer that the center is not dependent on the region. The center may still be dependent on the region. Because even though it's dependent, the region also has to have the credible exit option. And so lacking that, it doesn't matter. Similarly, even though the region has a credible exit option and is ignored, we can't infer that there will be concessions offered because the center is autonomous. That was the Czechoslovak example.
So let me just follow up on that with another reference to Scotland. In the Scottish referendum, there were very, very frequent opinion polls trying to see, what the sentiment for secession was, for Scottish secession was. And in the last poll, I think it was supposed to be a razor thin. It was unclear which side was going to win. A very credible exit threat because of those poll numbers. So what did the three parties of the three major English parties do 2 days before the referendum vote? They said, we are going to vow to significantly extend Scottish powers fiscally and politically if you vote no. that swung the election, and the Scots voted no 55-40, something like that. So because there was such a credible exit record, the leaders of the three English parties, the Tories, the Labour Party, and the Lib Dems, made this public vow to improve Scottish, to create greater autonomy for Scotland. So after, of course, after the Scots voted no, the English reneged on their agreement, which suggests that they've got lots of trouble going forward, not just because of Brexit, but because of this broken promise. So it's again sort of consistent with the model that we offered, and that the credible exit option in a democracy really depends on the likely political support for secession.
And then I just show you a funny picture as well. So this is Jura, Bernois at the bottom, the small one, and the bigger one is the Canton of Jura. And this is propaganda, obviously, from the Bern side, saying, and there were a number of others that were not quite as clean as this one, about how the people in Jura are using the public funds and misusing the public funds. And so if you join them, your money will go there and will also be misused in this way. So this was, I mean, for Swiss politics, it seemed quite impassioned. So,
Well, thank you very much, professors, for this clear presentation. I think we have a lot of reactions from our public. I don't know who gonna break the ice.
And so let me just say that neither of us are experts on Catalan politics. So one of the things that would be interesting to learn about is how this might relate or not relate to the situation. So we welcome any thoughts, and we hope to learn something from you. Thank you.
So thank you very much for your talk. And I studied political science, but I don't consider myself a political scientist. So I might know, I'm more interested about the normative side of the issue, not exactly about the empirical side. Starting by the talk of Professor Hechter, maybe the relevance is not on religion nowadays. Maybe religion is just pointing a sort of more cultural, more political, more identity. So maybe religion is not explaining, it's just pointing kind of political identity that actually, as far as I read about Swiss politics, it used to be very important, the religious cleavage, and nowadays it's more the linguistic, more the political, more the territorial cleavage, which it was a kind of substitution. It's not that it's more or less the same entities were substituting one another. It didn't change the territorial dimension of them, but they just changed the importance of whether religion or political or cultural identity. So, what do I mean, for instance? And let me put an example that I know more. For instance, in Catalonia, we believe that Montserrat, which is a very important temple, Christian temple, it's a kind of national place, it's a symbolic place. But it's not because we are Catholics or practicing Catholic. No, it's because it's a national symbol. So it's this kind of the prior religious becomes then a cultural symbol, and there's this kind of dimension. And the same community, before identified with religion, now it's identified with another, is a path towards secularization of the symbols. And this kind of cultural and political identity, I don't think it's a political tendency about right and left wing. I think it might be sometimes that the leftists are younger people and they are more optimistic. So they think, oh, let's change and let's try what happens. And usually right-minded people, they are more conservative and say, oh, let's keep things like they are and let's not risk it. And for instance, this, because you were talking about the example of Scotland, Dr. Keating, I think you might be familiar with him, has been denying that explaining the independence of Scotland, it's about understanding a more leftist or rightist politics. He's saying that is a kind of, this is public speech, but then the left and right preferences, even on the topic of the European Union, are not so different from Scotland and England. Actually, he thinks that Scotland is very similar to the north of England, for instance. Very, very similar. And ending here, I would say that Professor Tierney, Professor of Constitutional Law, and when he was talking about the vow, he said that actually the last statistics said that the vow didn't have a lot of effect on the preferences of the voters. I'm not so sure about that. So the preferences voting for independence or union were taken before the vow was made. The last point is just data for you, and maybe you can explore why he's saying that. That's it. Then maybe if nobody wants to keep talking, I have some questions about the model. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I certainly agree with you. I thought that your discussion on Montserrat was absolutely right. I mean, I've got no problem with that. I believe David tested for age. I mean, age was held constant in our results.
Yes, we did look at age.
I don't think age was an issue. I mean, we had pretty good data here. The other thing is, we did a mediation analysis, and we found that actually both religion and language did work through status preferences. It was a fairly complicated statistical. Yeah, age wasn't important. So we could actually rule out some of the explanations that you said on the basis of the data that we had. As to the vow, I don't know how this guy would ever be able to demonstrate that it had no effect on the outcome. The most recent poll before the referendum showed it was basically 50-50, and the referendum showed a 10-point favor, 10-point advantage in favor of Remain rather than exit. So, I mean, I don't know how he would be able to say the vow had no effect. I mean, he could be right, but what's the evidence? I see. It may be a problem. Yeah, I don't know.
So I would just add, I agree that, and I think we were trying to suggest that religion as such was not really central, but that it was used instrumentally. And so if you think about the decision that they had, if they had joined, so the fact that they stayed where they were made them a linguistic, linguistic minority, which allowed them to use that fact as a bargaining language. Language is somewhat different than religion, but you know, if it were religion, then you think, oh, they stayed there because they want to be with their fellow religionists, because religion is so important. They could not imagine being together with someone. But really, what we think is that it had to do with the fact that remaining a minority in this way, as a linguistic minority, which is protected in some sort of constitutional way in Switzerland, gave them this bargaining language. If they were a religious minority in Jura, and they said we want protections because of religion. Religion is not protected in the same way. So if this story is true, then it's an entirely instrumental use of culture, religion or language, in order to be in a position that would allow them to extract greater concessions going forward.
Thank you. I was trying to figure out where Catalonia would be in your second speech, and one of the factors I need to understand is how you measure, how you define the credibility of the threat. Because I can see, I mean, the dependence to me is easy. I mean, it's economic, I suppose. But how did you measure the credibility? On which basis? The institutional, the political preferences, so it changes? Just a bit of that I would like to know.